title. Okay, the next paper is The Economic Impacts of Clean Power by Kostas Arkalakis and Connor Walsh.
Great. Thanks so much for having us here and having us on the program. I think there's a widespread sense that we're living through a time of great technical change. And one area that's certainly true is in electricity markets. So this figure is showing that the share of renewable electricity, particularly from solar and wind, has been increasing rapidly in the US over the last decade, from a baseline of virtually nothing around the time of the financial crisis to about 14% now. This is different across regions, but most regions are participating in this. We've seen particularly fast growth in places like California and Texas, both of solar and wind. And when you look at where this is coming from, it's really coming from two places. One is that the flows into new generation on the grid are almost entirely renewables at this point. So the blue line up there is solar, wind, and batteries over the last sort of 10 years. They're increasing over time to the point now we're at sort of 3 gigawatts a month being added to the grid in renewables. Fossil fuels as a group are exiting the grid. That's the dark black line there. What's been happening there is coal has been exiting very rapidly. Gas was still being built in substantial amounts up until a few years ago, but now that has even started to drop off. And there's virtually nothing happening outside these technologies. So hydro and nuclear are staying around the same levels. This is not just a US phenomenon, so this is happening all around the world. It's part of a broad shift that's driven by significant cost falls in the price of these renewable technologies. So in particular, I'm showing here the all-in unsubsidized costs of building a new solar plant or building a new wind plant in a range of major industrial economies, both developing and developed. Solar in particular has been declining extremely fast, around 17% a year. This goes back a decade, but you can take it back 2 decades. You see a similar decline. Wind is slower, but it did start off a lower base, and now we're at the point that for a marginal megawatt of generation, saying nothing about storage, which I'll touch on in a second, wind and solar are by far the cheapest technologies for bulk energy supply in most places in the world. The pace of decline of solar actually is around the fastest declines that we've seen for any industrial good in the BEA investment price series. 17% is on the order of price declines for ICT. Now, what we do in this paper, we have 3 parts to the paper. One is what we're going to do is use capital cost projections into the near future to develop electricity price bounds that are going to hold at the local level. So we'll develop upper bounds on electricity prices at a very disaggregated spatial scale. And then we're going to feed these price bounds through a class of spatial general equilibrium models to try and estimate the impact on local wages of moving to a high renewable penetration grid. And then the last thing we'll do in the paper, which I won't really get to talk about today, is use a more long-term growth model to think about how renewables shift aggregate innovation resources, sort of lifting the resource curse that has been dogging productivity growth for some time. I'll say at the outset, what we do here is deliberately optimistic in that we're going to assume cost falls for renewables continue into the near future. We're trying with this paper to take a counterbalance to what has been a systematic underestimation of renewable growth for decades now. I think most analyses in the literature have assumed that price falls were a one-off and that they would stop soon, and they've just continued relentlessly year by year. So what we're going to do as a countermeasure is say, well, let's just suppose this continues for a decade or so more. Where are we going to end up? What we show in the paper is that costs for firm solar power, so solar backed up entirely by battery storage, is projected to fall quite significantly between now and 2040. So right now, if you want to back up solar completely with battery storage, it still remains quite expensive relative to natural gas. You can see that on the left-hand column there. The most of the all-in capital costs component of firm solar is the battery right now. But we project, and many others do as well, that these storage costs are going to start to fall quite significantly into the future. Why? Well, because they've been falling very rapidly in the past few decades. So storage, the price per kilowatt hour has fallen about 100 times in the last, or 100-fold in the last 30 years. And particularly with the expansion of EVs and building out grid-scale storage, this is likely to continue out into the future. So we're going to use some of these numbers to try and think about what the falls in renewable capital costs are going to imply for local wholesale generation costs across the US. So we use a pretty simple no arbitrage equation to think about the long-run implications of cheap renewables. If you think about the all-installed project cost as just the upfront capital cost of renewables backed by storage, anywhere that this is installed on the grid, spatially in the US, it needs its average revenues over time to cover the costs. So on the right, think about all-in firm storage costs, firm solar costs, and on the left, think about the discounted revenues that you would get from this on average over time. Now, the interesting thing about renewables and why they place such downward pressure on prices in wholesale markets is they have zero marginal costs, zero fuel costs. And what that means is when they tend to bid into auctions to generate electricity in wholesale markets, they almost always win these auctions because they can supply for very, very low marginal costs. So here we'll just represent them as having no fuel costs and essentially getting revenues, but where the potential electricity that you get out of a solar panel or a wind turbine will differ dramatically across space. So that'll be that theta term there. Just to give you a rule of thumb, a solar panel that you set up in Arizona will generate something like twice as much electricity as you would get out of a panel in Maine, and something like 3 times as much as you would get out in, say, Scotland. Now, this price no arbitrage equation isn't going to hold everywhere. In particular, there are places where you're just not going to be able to install significant amounts of solar and wind because land costs are particularly high. So say you're not going to be able to pave over Manhattan and supply Manhattan's electricity with solar just because there's no land available. But it does place an upper bound on what the prices need to be in places where you can develop the solar electricity. And so we're going to do this entirely for solar. You can do the same thing for wind. And what we do is use these use estimates of both the potential, these thetas across space, so basically the average solar installation that you'll get in a year, and estimates of land costs at a very disaggregated spatial level to draw a map of the US and plot what these wholesale price bounds imply. And what you get is you get very, very low generation costs in the future at the local level. So in particular, you know, we'd project something like $20 a megawatt hour for places like Arizona, Colorado, and parts of California by 2040. For reference, the average generation costs right now across the US are closer to $50, but that ranges upwards to $80 and $90 in New England and also in parts of California. So these are significant price falls from what we're seeing today. Note as well that you'll get a lesser impact in kind of the northeast of the US. Why is that? Well, it is because partly the solar insulation resources are nowhere near as strong in these places, but also the land costs are just much, much higher than you would have out in undeveloped areas of Arizona and New Mexico. So that's how we develop these price bounds for 2040. We also then feed them through a class of general equilibrium models. There's been a lot of research recently in thinking about the disaggregated impacts of price shocks in macroeconomic models. And so what we do is think about the US as being composed of heterogeneous sectors and heterogeneous locations and trace the first order impact of price falls in such a setting. Now, when you do this, it becomes quickly apparent that the places that are most exposed to falls in electricity prices tend to be rural places. Why is that? No surprise, their industry mixes are dominated by things that use electricity much more heavily than services. Services dominate the economies of particularly large cities like DC and New York, but the price exposure, at least in this class of models, is something like twice as high in rural areas as it is in denser urban areas. And so it's going to be the interaction, basically, of this exposure or this sufficient statistic that we derive in this class of equilibrium models interacted with the price bounds map. That'll give you local wage estimate, local impacts for wages across space. So when we do this, we run this through the model and we develop estimates of impacts on wages across US counties for 3,000 US counties. The impact is very heterogeneous, like I said. The average wage growth that you would expect is about 2%. Why is that? Well, in most counties, like I mentioned, the total amount of exposure to electricity prices tends to be quite low, but there are several counties and larger areas, places like San Diego, Salt Lake City, and several cities in California, that see much higher estimated wage changes. And mostly that's because A, they have a lot of sunlight, but B, they have industry mixes that are more heavily exposed to electricity, like aluminum smelting, for example. The other thing we do in the paper is consider building out the transmission network to take advantage of this spatial heterogeneity and renewable potential. The idea being getting some of this very cheap electricity from Arizona and moving it to higher load areas where the local solar insolation resources aren't quite as high. What you get from doing that is actually substantial benefits. So we think about an exercise of full integration of the grid, building out transmission capacity to essentially eliminate spatial differences in prices. And that increases the wage growth by almost 1% on average across all these counties. So in the aggregate, if you assumed a stable labor share, that would be something like $250 billion each year in extra output. So that's something that you might think about if you were doing dynamic scoring of transmission line infrastructure. And then the last thing I want to say is thinking more about the longer term. So we focus very much on just the next 10 years when we think about the price impacts in general equilibrium of moving to high renewable penetrations. But there's something that you might think is also important, which is the longer term impacts on innovation. So there's been a range of studies in the literature that have talked about the growth slowdown that we've experienced since the 1970s. And in a number of Brookings papers, actually, Bill Nordhaus has pointed at least some of the finger at rising energy prices. So we experienced a series of energy price shocks in the 1970s. They never really went away, and significant amounts of innovation resources have been directed into energy efficiency in the last 50 years. So not just thinking about fuel standards for cars, but also energy efficiency standards for refrigerators, TVs, and the like. Now, once you move to an energy system that's dominated by renewables being accumulable capital that don't rely on extracted resources, you get to redirect some of these aggregate innovation resources towards general TFP growth. So we build off some of the estimates in the literature to think about what that could do to aggregate growth. And it's speculative, of course, because we know comparatively less about aggregate TFP innovation. But something suggests that you would get something like an extra 10% of GDP by 2050 by redeploying these aggregate innovation resources away from energy efficiency. So that's about all I've got time for, so I'll just leave it there and leave it to the discussants.
Thank you. The first discussant is Koichiro Ito.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm going to put my energy environment economist hat to first emphasize why this paper is very important. So energy expansion is key to mitigating climate change, at least for 3 reasons. So first of all, already we are using a lot of electricity. And if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, in the US, about a quarter of it comes from electricity sector. So it's a big sector. But also, we are having very potentially exciting and big changes in the society right now. So number 2 reason is the transportation sector, which is another big greenhouse gas emission sector, is going to electrify very soon. And that means electricity sector is going to basically become even bigger sector. Then another news you probably have seen is AI is poised to skyrocket electricity demand from data centers. So for many reasons, we think about climate change, we have to think about how to move from coal power plants to renewable power plants. So this is a really important question, and they are looking at medium, long run as perspective. So that's great. So good news is, as Connor mentioned, we have very big change in the last maybe 20 years. So when I was a graduate student, I think I remember we heard wind is coming, so it's great, but solar is just so expensive, so forget about it. So that was like 2010, 2011. But now, mainly this is because of Chinese manufacturers, competition and research and development, we are having quite a steep decline in solar power cost. So this is great. So the question is, what is the future prospect of renewable energy and its implications for electricity prices, but also the economy as a whole? So this paper is addressing this question. So this is innovative, rigorous, and policy-relevant paper. And I think the main innovation comes from the equation Connor mentioned. So concept is very simple economics. So use a medium run equilibrium condition to think about marginal investment cost and use it to forecast future wholesale prices in the US. So I am in kind of IO energy environmental field. So what we usually do is to look at wholesale market, collect data, model farms, consumers. There's probably value to it, but that involves a lot of exercise data collection for entire markets. However, their method is very innovative, very simple, and they can actually look at the whole region. So this is really innovative, clever way to look at this problem. And the findings are so hopeful. Future is bright. So by 2040, power prices will fall anywhere between 20% and 80%. And this is not driven by subsidies or government policies. This is driven by markets, okay? So I was reading the paper and so happy if this is true. Dream world. So let's think about, is this too good to be true or futuristic scenario, okay? So maybe one thing helpful is to look at some other countries who are doing it probably a lot earlier than the US. So looking at the Chile example can be helpful. And I know it's always annoying that discussants bring their own papers to advertise, but this is what I'm doing. So I worked with Luis Gonzalez and Ma Regwand, and we looked at Chile example. So essentially, Chile made a big investment in transmission line. And what you can see is before they had market integration, they already had some solar in Atacama Desert area. You can see like a blue area. Those are like low prices. And then once they integrate the market, there's like a renewable low prices spread out the nationwide. So in a sense, Chile is already getting renewable-based, cheaper wholesale electricity market prices. So in a sense, like what they're imagining is not futuristic or unrealistic. This is actually happening there. By the way, we also do a dynamic scoring exercise in this paper, comparing static and dynamic, so you will see the difference. One more thing I actually picked up from the website yesterday was that Chile system operator puts like what kind of electricity plants are under construction. And this is super interesting to me and to authors probably. The yellow one, like 53%, you see is a solar. So in Chile, massive new plants are, massive capacity of new plants are now entirely solar. But interesting one you can see is the gray, that is storage. And the pink is probably the most interesting to this paper. The pink, it says FV and BESS, that's solar plus storage together. So solar storage together coming in, that's what they're modeling, it's already happening, okay? So it's not the futuristic world, at least in Chile. And then I'm gonna come back to realistic United States world and talk about a few challenges possibly for discussion. So one thing to think about, I already talked to the authors, is that we are pretty confident that the wind and solar power costs are declining and probably keep declining for the future. But if you talk to the people in the industry, there's still controversy about the battery cost. So some people say battery cost is not going to go down much because it's more complicated chemical development and other things. But other people are more excited because, and particularly because of new EV demand. Tesla and other companies, they are trying to develop better and better batteries. So those R&D could make the price decline much more. We are not sure which is the case, okay? But basically the result they provided is heavily based on the affordable batteries, because otherwise you can't use solar all the time. So this is going to be the key feature to the conclusion of the paper. This one is not anything their fault, okay? This is the US government fault, if you think about. So there is an interesting issue called interconnection queue you might heard about. So the most crazy thing happening in the US is, so those solar and wind power plants, those investors coming in and they want to build, but they have to wait in this queue to get a study and approval. And the average wait time right now is 5 years. Okay, so if you come in, you can start operating in 2000, maybe 30. Okay, so this is a big issue, and the capacity waiting is now 2 times the whole U.S. existing power plant fleet. So this is a problem, and the FERC is trying to solve this problem. Each electricity markets are trying. I'm not sure if it's going to be solved in 5-10 years. But the thing is, this kind of regulatory constraint could add uncertainty and also delay to the investments. So how to think about in the model can be helpful to think about. So other thing I want to mention is in the US, at least currently, what people are wondering about is this curtailment problem. So maybe you haven't seen this, so I want to just describe it. The left-hand side figure is showing California, mostly solar, and the right-hand side is showing south region of the US, mostly wind. And this is the amount of electricity we are throwing away because those electricity cannot go anywhere because of limited transmission capacity. So the argument is if you have batteries, you can do intertemporal substitution, but is it enough, right? So is it enough to meet the demand locally, or do you really need to send it to somewhere to send all the production from solar and wind? That point is probably not super clear yet. So I hope we can solve this problem by 2040, but I want to just bring up this issue. Final point is, what they did was to focus on solar, which is totally great and interesting. But interesting feature of the US geographical variation in solar and wind is that it's almost like opposite. California has lots of solar, but Midwest has lots of wind. So if they run the same analysis for wind, which they can do, the macroeconomic impact implication can be very different. The regional winners and losers, industrial winners, losers. And if you do like wind and solar together, then we can see more winners from different types of industries. So I think adding the wind analysis might be actually really interesting. So I encourage authors to work on it. And then looking forward to discussion.
Thank you. And the second discussant is Neil Marucha.
Thanks to the organizers for having me here to discuss this very interesting paper. I have to include the usual disclaimer since I'm from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, but there's no monetary policy here, so I don't think we should be in any issues. Okay, so this paper finds there's sort of two big quantitative conclusions that come out of this paper. First, the fall in battery and solar prices can drive a 20 to 80% reduction in wholesale electricity prices. So that's a pretty big change in the price of electricity. Those lower electricity prices raise wages by 2 to 3% nationwide, and there's a more sort of speculative part of the paper that argues that this may significantly raise the underlying TFP growth rate of the economy. I'm going to focus my comments mostly to argue that the electricity price declines are likely to be much more modest than what they find, and they can be more modest for different reasons. Maybe their assumptions about technology cost declines are too optimistic. I don't think that's the reason. I think that other models do have similar sharp declines in the cost of solar and batteries. But there is a big difference between the system cost of electricity and what they look at in the paper, which is related to the levelized cost of electricity. And so I'm going to try and go through what those differences are. And I'm also going to look at recent trends in electricity prices and also argue that the connection between technology costs and electricity prices may not be as strong as assumed in this paper. Okay, so there is a literature that's largely adjacent or outside of economics that tries to think about what current and future technology mean for electricity prices. So there's a literature in energy systems modeling that tries to look at that tries to run projections of future prices. And what I'm showing here is a projection from a multi-model study of energy systems projections. They're looking at both the retail and wholesale price of electricity and how that's likely to evolve through 2050. And there's a lot of heterogeneity across these models, but they generally find much more modest declines in the price of electricity. So between now and 2050, there's about a 1 or 2% decline in the retail price of electricity, and there's a larger, or about 20% decline in the wholesale price of electricity. So that's close to the 20 to 80% that that's at the higher end of the 20 to 80% that Costas and Connor find, but it's also they find that in 2050 instead of 2040. So the estimate in the paper is about a 40% decline nationwide in wholesale prices. What these energy systems models finds around 15%. So what is the source of that difference? So one possible difference could be that they have different underlying assumptions of how cheap capital will get over time. So the top part of this table is looking at the cost for the capital cost of natural gas, solar, and solar backed up by battery in 2023, 2040, and 2050. These numbers come from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, what they call the annual technology baseline, where they look out and they try to project forward solar and battery prices. And what you can see is that they're projecting pretty big declines. By 2040, a 50% decline in the capital cost of solar, similar declines for solar plus battery, and by 2050, close to 60% decline in these capital costs. So this is a little bit less optimistic than what you guys have, but it's in the same ballpark, and just over a longer period of time. So how do we translate capital cost into the price of electricity? Well, one way we can do that is what's called the levelized cost of electricity. The levelized cost of electricity is just given by these two equations at the bottom. And basically all these equations say is it's the break-even price of electricity. What is the price of electricity needed for a particular technology, be it solar, wind, natural gas? What is the price of electricity needed to cover the capital cost, cover its fixed cost, and cover whatever fuel costs? And taking into account that this is a technology that lasts over a significant period of time. So if you invert that equation, what you get is that the levelized cost of electricity for any particular generation I is its fuel cost multiplied by this theta I, which is or the inverse of theta I, which is a really crucial parameter, which is the capacity factor. How expensive capital is depends on how intensely it's used. Capital that's used very intensively is cheaper than capital that's used very seldomly. So these capacity factors are quite important in what comes out for the levelized cost of electricity. Anyways, when you do this calculation using these numbers from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, what you see is that natural gas and solar today have the same levelized cost. And solar plus battery is more expensive, but the levelized cost comes down significantly on the same order of magnitude as the decline in capital costs. So should we think that the technology cost assumptions are not, I think, what are driving the big decline in wholesale prices? What we have to think about with electricity is that electricity demand has to be satisfied at every point in the day. And so let's take let's go through a couple of different examples that will illustrate the difference between the system cost and the levelized cost. So assume that you had this very strange-looking demand where there's only demand at the middle of the day. So there's only electricity demand at the middle of the day. This is obviously a situation that is not realistic, but is very favorable to solar. So you can meet demand in one of two ways. Demand has to be met at every point in time. So at the bottom are hours of the day, and on the y-axis is demand at various points. You can meet demand either through just using solar or just using natural gas. Now, in this particular example, what is the system cost of electricity? Well, the system cost of electricity is just the levelized cost for solar, because solar is only being used 1/3 of the time, which is what we assumed in the levelized cost calculation. Natural gas is much more expensive because this is a very unfavorable situation for natural gas. You have to build up 3 megawatts of generation capacity, but it's only used 1/3 of the time. And so that makes that the levelized cost calculation assume that it was used 2/3 of the time. So that lower capacity factor, that's the theta NG, is raising up the cost of just relying on natural gas. Now, this is one particular example that's very unfavorable to natural gas, but we can think about another example of where demand is constant all day long. This is, again, not a realistic example, but assume that you have a constant 1 megawatt of demand all day long. You have two ways of potentially meeting that demand. You could meet that demand just using natural gas, or you could use natural gas and solar. And in this particular case now, the system price of electricity, when you're using both solar and natural gas, is going to be a weighted average of the levelized cost. So again, it will be the case that as solar gets cheaper, it will pull down the system cost of electricity, but it'll do so by less because 2/3 of the generation is coming from natural gas. You can do the same exercise with just batteries. So you could have just batteries and solar. That means building up a lot more solar during the day and charging those batteries to serve you in the evening and overnight. And if you do that what you can see is that the levelized cost calculation looks quite different than the system cost calculation because now those capacity factors are endogenous. And it has to be the case that whatever is being used to serve demand at different times, how intensely is that capital being used? In this particular example, natural gas is the cheapest in using 2023 capital prices, but then solar and natural gas are the cheaper options in 2040 and 2050, but solar plus storage is still more expensive, even though it becomes more competitive over time. And if we think about then what is the change in the wholesale price, it's relatively limited between 2023 and 2050. Solar has come down 50% in price, but the decline in the wholesale price of electricity is about 10%. Think about another more realistic scenario where you have a spike in demand in the evenings and you have very low demand in the middle of the night. You could meet the demand in various different ways. You could use just natural gas. You could use solar plus natural gas. You could use solar and batteries. You could also use solar batteries and natural gas. And each of these is going to have a different system cost of electricity. What you get is that natural gas is the cheapest option in 2023. By 2050, all of these options become quite close together. The cheapest option is some combination of solar, storage, and natural gas. But the point is, if you look at the lowest price in 2023 versus the lowest price in 2050, there's only about a 10 or 15% difference in price. So these capacity factors become very important when we think about the wholesale price of electricity and how that's likely to evolve. One other thing to keep in mind is that electricity prices, so at the top of this table, I'm showing electricity prices, various different measures, residential, industrial cost, PPI measures of electricity. Those have gone up in real terms over the last 15 or 20 years. So if we look back, electricity has gotten slightly more expensive across most measures over a 15 or 20-year time horizon. But this is a time in which the two most important cost inputs have gotten a lot cheaper. Fuel, in particular, has gotten considerably cheaper in real terms over this period. Natural gas prices are down 40 or 60%, depending on a 15 or 20-year horizon. And the cost of capital has come down significantly. Treasury rates are half what they were 15 or 20 years ago. And technological progress in equipment has reduced capital costs. That has not translated into a lower price of electricity. So there's other things clearly that are going on in electricity markets that I think are important to understand here. Anyone in California who looks at their electricity bill, you get a lot of solar in electricity, a lot of solar in California, a lot of solar electricity in California, but a very high bill. Okay, so what are my takeaways here? I think the solar and battery cost assumptions that they have in the paper are optimistic, but they're comparable. They're in the range of what other energy systems modeling uses. But the system-wide cost can differ markedly from levelized cost, and I think ensuring adequate dispatchable capacity remains a challenge, even with renewables and batteries. The examples that I was giving you earlier are examples that are very favorable to using batteries because every day is like the previous day and there's no seasonal variation. You don't have to worry about the weather. So that's a situation that's very favorable to using batteries. And this issue of the system-wide cost, I think, is true irrespective of whether there's a zero emissions target or not. This is not a last-mile problem with getting to zero emissions. This would be true under natural gas as well. So I think there's likely to be a wholesale price reduction because of solar and batteries, but probably in the more modest 10 to 20% range. So I'm over time. I'm just going to end there. I have a couple of comments on the macro side, but I'll leave that for the written discussion.
Thank Thank you. Let's start with Steve Davis.
Thanks. Appreciated that, and especially the skeptical notes and the discussants' comments. Having just moved from Illinois to California not too long ago, the electricity costs and prices at the retail level in California are jolting, to say the least, despite all the solar power. I wanted to add, it seems to me, one more reason to think that the effective cost reductions achieved are likely to be less than the idealized ones that I think are emphasized in the paper, and that is the pricing of retail pricing of electricity, which is often politicized and, for a technical term, screwed up. So, so there's another thing I learned in California. So we bought a hybrid vehicle in California because that's also favored. But you get the lowest, despite all the push to solar in California, you get the lowest pricing on your retail, at least in my residential area, after midnight at night, when of course nobody's generating solar power. So that's just an example, but I think the larger point I want to put on the table is that retail pricing of electricity in California, for sure, but sometimes elsewhere, has been highly politicized in ways that don't lead to an efficient use, an efficient draw on the system-wide resources over the day, over the week, and so on. So that seems to me to be another factor, like the interconnection issue, that is likely to inhibit our ability to achieve some of these potential cost reductions.
Carolyn Hawksby.
I was hoping that either the authors or one of the discussants could comment more on the divergence between wholesale prices and retail price increases that we have seen recently, because people only respond to what they see, the retail price increases. So just a few further comments on that would be helpful.
Wozniak.
Thanks. I guess I have a plea and then also a suggestion. And so the plea is kind of for the next paper, either that you write, Connor, or that folks in this area write, which is to start thinking a lot harder about the welfare impacts at kind of this community level. And the reason this came to mind is if you zoom out from what you were saying, you're telling us we have a technology. It's going to lower prices across the board in the economy. Everyone's going to win. This sounds wonderful, and economists are going to be on board with that. It's just like the technology that we are still arguing about right now today as to whether we should have higher or lower tariffs. And I think that economists lost a lot of credibility for kind of failing to quickly recognize how the use of that technology would be received. And it would be nice to somehow learn from that and factor that in, I think, sooner. I guess the suggestion is this feels very achievable to me in this particular context. If you are citing a big solar project, there are going to be public hearings that are recorded. There will be text. There will be community outreach by your local utility commission that will be recorded. We now have big data analysis that makes it easier for us to ingest this. I know that what I'm talking about sounds a bit like sociology, but I actually think economists could start using those as inputs to think a lot harder and faster about those overall welfare impacts. And I guess I'll just kind of finish by saying Neil didn't get to talk about why he thought the welfare gains might be understated. I think a concern I have is that they might be a bit overstated, particularly if you get this rapid change. It might be good in all kinds of dimensions, but rapid change in itself does not seem to be welfare enhancing for a lot of folks. So again, just kind of trying to fold all of those in, get to that kind of bottom line a bit sooner that I know folks are going to experience one way or another.
Steinson.
Yeah, I wanted to actually emphasize a way in which I think the authors are underestimating the benefits of this change. Many people are discussing ways in which they may be overestimating the change. But one thing that the authors are leaving out of their analysis, as far as I understand it, is electrification. And so when the authors come to the conclusion that these changes are going to bring an increase in wages of 2 to 3%, that's based on a cost share of electricity today, but if we electrify, heating, house heating, transport, and other things are also going to become electricity, and the cost share of electricity is going to go up a lot. So I think that actually might be like a factor of 2 or 3 in terms of underestimating the benefits of these changes that they're talking about. Now, on the other hand, of course, that also puts a lot more strain on this interconnection queue, and do we have enough land, and are we really going to get to the steady state that they're emphasizing by 2040? But I think the potential gains from this are maybe three times larger than they emphasize.
Susan?
Yeah, so thanks for the great paper and the discussant comments. I think the time of day stuff particularly seems very important in the overall applications. A lot of the conferences that I've been going to have focused a lot more on the demand side around AI and other types of cases. I guess it might be, you were kind of doing this, but sometimes focusing on the price seems a little strange given all of the demand effects that we're also seeing happening. And so I think thinking about a supply curve in different scenarios for electrification and also increased demand in some people's futuristic visions, there's going to be lots and lots of demand for AI and burning electricity, and so in some sense we're going to be just limited by the cost. So thinking about the demand curve and the supply curve separately, because they each have their own considerations. Certainly the AI people seem very concerned not just about the cost, but also the transmission. In my previous government role, that's something I also saw. If we think about policies out there, just low-hanging fruit, where we've allowed ourselves to be satisfied with an institutional scenario where the people making decisions about transmission generally benefit from high prices, whether they are government entities or private entities, and we have not decided to make decisions about transmission in the interest of consumers or economic growth. That seems like low-hanging fruit. Like if you think you could get that boost to GDP that way, there's just like a low-hanging policy thing here of just like actually build the freaking transmission and stop letting people block it based on market power. So obviously that's easier said than done, but that's, that we're in a room full of people who are can-do, fix-it people. This is a place to say it. But more broadly, really thinking about all the scenarios for demand and the general equilibrium, it's going to probably lead to higher prices than what you said, but also lots of other shifts.
Christy Romer.
I just wanted to raise a question about sort of the long-term outlook on solar prices, which is one of the things you mentioned was it's coming very much from technological innovation in China. I feel a disconnect because I feel a lot of our government is telling us we need to stop the China sending us cheap solar panels, which at one level sounds completely insane, and on the other level, their argument is it's a predatory pricing kind of thing. So I guess the question is, how does all that political economy around trade policy impact your possible results?
Adele Morris and then Wendy Edelberg.
Yeah, thanks. Super interesting discussion. A couple thoughts. One is, you mentioned that these projections aren't subject to the subsidy programs, but they may be subject to other public policies, whether it's subsidies for electrification or state and local policies like RGGI and AB 32 in California. There might be renewable mandates and targets at the state level that could be playing a role, and I wouldn't gloss over the role of public policy there. I think you make the case in the paper that the land is available for the solar deployment, but it's not going to be free, and there can be impacts on land markets. And so if you're, going to do a more fulsome welfare analysis, you're going to want to look at what's happening to land prices. And finally, you didn't even really talk about air quality benefits, which is like one of the biggest boons to society from the deployment of renewables. And if you're looking for TFP, I would be looking at the literature on air quality and criteria air pollutants and so on, and those can be local and big.
The endogenous effect of the increase in demand, I think, is really, the projected increase in demand, I think, is really interesting. Even just 2 years ago, working with economists who are experts in this and in this area and climate scientists and such, they were quite worried about how the transition would be impeded by slow demand growth. And that was going to make it really hard to create the investments, to do the investment, to do the capital infrastructure projects that we were going to need. And now that seems to be completely upended. And so I'm wondering how these projections of now much faster demand growth are going to affect the calculations.
Henry Aaron?
A genuine question. The queue that you described of 5 years and twice the current capacity sounds quite incredible. What is the source of that? What would it cost to reduce it? And an impish question, how would you dynamically score investments to reduce that queue?
Okay, did I miss anybody? Good. Okay, we'll go back to the author for reaction.
Great. Well, thanks so much for all those comments. They were really great. Maybe I'll just address a couple of them. Maybe I want to respond to Neil, particularly on whether you can infer the impact of renewables on prices just looking from the aggregate time series. I don't think that's really possible. I mean, we know at the nodal level, you push down wholesale prices, the more renewables penetrate the grid. I think we know what's going on in the aggregate. The divergence between retail prices and wholesale prices you outlined has really been an artifact of what some people have brought up, that demand growth was just flat for the last 20 years. Utilities weren't expecting that, and so they overinvested in distribution infrastructure and then tried to pass those costs on to the customers. Whether that's going to be true in the future with demand growth speeding up again, I think is an open question. I don't know the answer to, but I think just looking at the aggregate time series, it's hard to say something about that. And then, yeah, whether we're overestimating or underestimating the benefits of the change, I think just to at your point of system costs, I think you're right. But what those energy system models miss a little bit is an equilibrium condition, that most of the generation markets in the US are now decentralized, both spatially and separating distribution and generation. And what that means is if you have dispatchable solar that's completely backed up by storage for a merchant plant, which can choose when to dispatch its solar at any time in the day, if prices are above their levelized cost of energy, or what we outline, which is something very similar, then that induces entry. So I can't say that exactly what's going to happen to quantities when that happens, but I can point out that that's not going to be an equilibrium outcome. And then, I think just on Christy Romer's point, the long-term outlook, whether this is predatory pricing or not, I think there's something to that. So the Chinese solar manufacturers are definitely producing below cost right now, but this was pointed out in the Obama administration that they were predatory pricing then, and there's been almost a 90% fall in costs since then, and expansion. They've expanded capacity 100 times since then. So I think we'll see.
I guess responding to the question that Caroline asked about retail versus wholesale. So my understanding is that in California, for example, all the wildfire mitigation that's being done is being folded into the retail price. And that wildfire mitigation is very, very expensive. And I mean, conceptually, it could be a separate line item on the budget, but it's just being folded into this. So some of what Connor's talking about, the divergence between retail and wholesale prices, has to do with other aspects of climate change, right? Like hardening the infrastructure for climate change. But that table that I showed at the end was also commercial prices, also industry prices. So it wasn't just retail prices that haven't really budged or have drifted up, despite the huge decline in natural gas prices and the cost of capital generally. So, electricity markets are complicated, and so there's many different things that might be going on. There was one paper that I'm aware of that notes that regulated rates of return, the interest rate that they use on that, has not moved down in lockstep with the Treasury rate, and so utilities commissions haven't revised their rates of return to market rates, so that might be an element at work.
John asked me to comment on the interconnection queue. Yeah, so this is definitely a big problem. I mean, the 5 years that we talked about is slowing things down significantly. In our analysis, though, we're trying to do a steady state analysis. And what the delay in the interconnection queue does in the steady state analysis is just shift the revenues forward 5 years. So at a very simplistic level, it doesn't affect our numbers that much. I think the real problem, though, is it's not about shifting the revenues forward 5 years. It's significantly increasing the risks that you'll ever actually get out of the interconnection queue. And we see a lot of people failing and just falling out of the interconnection queue instead of waiting the 5 years. It's something our framework is not really good at handling. I think what we're just hoping is the case is that by 2040 or by 2050, this is a transitional issue and we'll make it there.
Maybe I can add some points. So the interconnection queue, if you're interested, I'm happy to talk 30 minutes. So when I talked to Paul Jasko, he described as this is basically a system somebody created 20, 30 years ago when we didn't have any renewables. So usually like 1 or 2 coal, natural gas power plant come up, or let's assess it. But now the problem is 200, 500 renewables, they want to come in. So they have a capacity issue. And then other issue is, to economists, it's interesting, but people are now doing a speculative entry because it's going to take a while. So let's bring 5 projects, and maybe 1 project can get through, then everybody does it. So it's a problem, and a lot of discussion in the FARC and electricity markets to solve it. I'm happy to talk more. I think the retail price issue is really important to Caroline's point. It's probably very difficult for them to accommodate, unfortunately. So the wholesale price is very clearly determined. It's a market-based. So what they do is, for the first order, correct. But there is a kind of deviation between wholesale price and retail price. And that depends on residential versus industrial. And then state-level regulation, rate cases, especially California is always have a disastrous rate cases and bring up subsidy money and those like fixed costs from 10 years ago, put it in. So I think if you seriously want to do it, you could do it, but kind of that would probably destroy their simplicity. So maybe that sounds like next paper they can do, but really important because I think they take the wholesale price almost as a retail price, right, to think about the impact. And that's, in a sense, misleading. So I think that's important. Finally, Christina's point about the China, I think that's even more important for storage, I think. Now U.S. government is thinking about very different policies about batteries from China versus batteries from the U.S. There's a lot of politics going on, and that would affect the future cost of batteries.
So one more point about this retail versus wholesale. I think I'm right when I say that large industrial users don't pay retail, they pay close to wholesale. So we shouldn't be thinking about retail as the whole market. Like the big factories in the world are paying wholesale. So that is actually a price that matters a lot.
One thing to add on John's point about electrification and perhaps the wage gains will be higher. Electrification also poses a big challenge for renewables because right now the peak demand for electricity is summertime when everybody turns on the air conditioning. But if everybody has heat pumps and electric cars, peak demand actually shifts to wintertime when solar is actually producing the least. And so if you have to have a bunch of natural gas power plants that are just hanging around for that winter peak demand, those are very expensive to maintain.
I would say yes on that, but on Koichiro's point, wind is actually producing most in the winter, so there's a nice offset there.
Okay, great. Thank you guys very much. Terrific discussion. That brings us to the end of the day. So for those who registered for dinner and cocktails start at 6 o'clock at the DuPont Circle Hotel, just up on the other side of DuPont Circle, and then at the hotel where we're staying. And dinner is scheduled to start at 6:30. And tomorrow morning, breakfast is at 8 o'clock and the program begins at 8:30. Great. So thanks to the authors and discussants today.
So they shut the nice job where the price is kind of